Hello and welcome to the next episode. So let's get back to where we left off in the last video. But just before I do, I just want to cover a couple of things. One of the things I want to cover is that please feel free to send in your comments and questions. If you've got any issues you're running into, please feel free to again ask your questions, and I will try and help you as much as I can. Not to say that I'll know the answer, but I may be able to find the answer and point you in the right direction. Even if you've got some video requests that you want to learn about or you want to know about, um, chuck them over, and I'll see if I can get a video done and see if I can then give you something to watch to try and help you understand that a bit more. So, with further ado, let's get back into what we were doing, right? So, since I've been off camera, what I've been doing is I've simply been setting up the admin panel, and what I wanted to do is go over a couple of things, and some good practice, maybe some good practice, depends on how you look at it. But yeah, so I've set up the events page. I've set up some breadcrumbs, which is dynamic. So anytime you create a page, it will go through each of these particular segments. It will then separate those into an array, loop through the array, go through each one, build up a string for each of those particular segment, and then create a URL for it. So let's go into the actual code. And yeah, so let's start with first, show you the actual code for the breadcrumbs like I just mentioned. So if we go into, I created a partial for it, and you can see here, ignore the squiggly lines, they aren't actually errors, it's just my PHP Storm doesn't seem to recognize that they exist even though they do. Don't know why. Anywho, so I'm creating a variable blade. We could refactor this at some point and maybe create a trait maybe that will build up the segment, do that in the trait, and then we pass it over to the view. We could do this maybe in a view composer instead. There's many different ways which we could refactor this code to maybe clean up the view a bit more and not actually do some logical stuff in the view, but rather do it in a class or controller or something like that. But we can come back to that at another stage. But quite simply, we create a segments string, empty string. Like I mentioned, we get the segments and then we're looping through them. In those segments, I'm creating a string and getting that individual segment. And this particular variable, every time it loops, is just going to keep adding to that string. And then what we're just doing href with the segments string, and then we're using the URL segment. Simple as that, really plain and simple. Like I said, probably could be refactored to be done into a different file, and rather than making the view very messy, we could refactor that at some point. But we'll come back to that. It's not urgent. It's working. There's no right or wrong way of doing that. It's just making code look nicer, that's all. So what I did as well is, if we go to the event controller, you can see here we're using the resource controller, and I've simply done events, event, all, view, and then compacted the events to the view. Very basic Laravel stuff. Now, this particular way of doing things is fine. There's no real, it's preference, I suppose, when it comes down to the right way and a possible wrong way. There is no wrong in doing this. However, what's going to happen as you go through your code, and you may be, I don't know, with events you may, trying to think of an example, with events you may also pass a particular user's variable as well, and then you might want to pass in some other variables. What will happen is you'll quickly see something like this in your code, and then you'll end up with a compact like this. Now, okay, fine, works. There's no wrong in doing that, but from a visual eye perspective, that's not very nice. It's not very clean. It's horrible to read. And there's a term called fat controllers. Now, anything that's fat, you know, is not good because it means it's bloated. It doesn't need to be as bloated as that. So what you want to have is a slim controller. Now, the way we can get around doing that is by using some patterns. Now, my favorite pattern is the repository pattern. The repository pattern, if you want to look at it very, very broadly, is quite simply you have your model, you have your controller, and then your pattern sits bang in that middle, and it talks between them. So you don't have your all your SQL stuff or eloquent stuff in your model, although some people do have designs like that where pretty much everything in terms of queries and eloquent is in their model. So again, it keeps your controller nice and skinny. But I don't like that because I find when I'm looking at a model, when you've got a lot of relationships, the file gets quite big. Now, when you start adding queries and scopes and all that kind of stuff, you end up from this big to this big. To me, that's not readable and it's not sustainable. So I like to use the repository pattern purely because it just helps keep your model skinny, your controller skinny, and then you have one file or files to help maintain your code base to be cleaner. Um, you could end up with a repository pattern that's this big, but then what you can do is you can begin to create multiple classes and filter out your logic into different classes. So I don't know, for example, you've got a repository that is for file system, say for example, and you've got different providers like Google, Dropbox, you name it. There's tons. Now, just imagine we've got our file repository, and you've got your Google logic in there, you've got your Dropbox logic in there. It's going to get quite messy. So what we could do is we could create a general file repository, which is what we've already got, and then we've got some classes that we can pull in when we instantiate a particular repo. Now, there is multiple different ways that we can do that. We could quite simply create an abstract class, which is your file repository. And then what you can do is then have your Google class implement that abstract class. So there's so many different ways. I'm not going to go into great detail. Um, you know, if you don't know what these terms are, or it's completely going over your head, the best thing to do is read. Even I still don't know everything. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to learn as I go along. Now that's probably the best way to do it is learn as you do it, not try and read it, forget about it type thing. So the best thing to do is implement what you read while you read it or learn about. So let's get back to what we're doing. So quite simply put, we can keep it like this, nothing wrong with it, but we'll end up with a fat controller. Now we don't want that, we want nice skinny controllers. So I mentioned about the repository pattern. So what we're going to do is, again, although I already know how to implement this particular pattern, I want to get you used to understanding logic behind of, okay, how do I do this? How do I figure out how to do this? So the best way to do that is simply Googling. Now, you need to be specific in what you Google. You can't just go, how do I do this, and it. You're not going to get the results you need. Now, the best way for this is quite simply, if we do Laravel repository pattern. Now this will bring up the results exactly what we need. Now there's a couple of ways that you can implement these repository patterns, and the one that I found recently to be quite nice was actually in one of these top ones. I think it was the second link. So we've got our repository. No, it wasn't this one. Might have been the top one then. Let's start. No, it was this one. So when you put in Laravel repository pattern, the very first link is the one that I found recently to be quite good. Good way to implement this. Now the reason being is, so if we come to actually reading this code and we come down to say, let's start with implementing the interface. The interface, if you want to look at it, if you're not sure what it is essentially a contract. A contract, which sometimes an interface is called a contract as well. So the contract is saying, right, we want exactly this, nothing else. If you do not give me this, I'm just going to yell at you that you need to give me it. So let's go ahead and do that. So the way I structure mine normally is I do my interfaces inside my app folder. So we do interfaces. You could also name that interface. No wrong in doing that, but I prefer interfaces because obviously it's multiple. So let's go ahead and we're going to go and create our interface. So what do we want to do? Well, I'm going to refer exactly back to this document and we're going to go through it. So, okay, so this is saying we've got a base repository and we've got an eloquent repository interface. Now, this to me is a bit premature in the way it's going, okay, we're going to use eloquent. Well, not being funny, if you're using Laravel, you're pretty much going to use eloquent, unless you're starting to scale your app beyond the point of, well, eloquent supposedly can be a little bit slower than doing raw DB statements, which I'm not going to get into that debate because some people say, no, it's not, it's fine. So we'll leave that. Anyway, so we've got our base repository, we've got our eloquent repository. So inside our eloquent repository, we're looking to say we've got create and we've got find. Simple as that. Within the interface, we don't actually implement any code. It's just purely simply public function, your function name, that's it. So let's copy this example, but I'm not going to follow this particular naming convention. I'm just going to quite simply go base not base repository, base interface. Now with PHP Storm we can quickly change this to an interface. If you're doing it from scratch, then what you'll see in a moment is if we implement that, you'll see you just need to implement that as an interface, not a class. So what we're going to say inside our interface, well, if we go back to our events, we're going to think, okay, events, that was the very function that I used. Okay, let's use that then. So let's go public function, and we're going to go all. There we go. There's our very first function in our interface that goes, we want. There's not, oh, you can give us it. No, we want all as a function. So, okay, fine. If you want that, we're going to give it to you. Now let's go back to this. So we've got a base repository. Okay. And then we've got a repository. Right. The reason that I actually prefer this method and not this particular method, whereby we're just quite simply going interface and then we're basically giving it the repository. I'll explain now. So if we go back to the base repository, knowing full well that this particular repository is going to be used quite regularly, i.e. the find, the create, the all. When you do it this way, you end up creating a user repository. You end up creating an events repository. But then both those repositories will have all, find, create, and it'll be duplicated. Now you want to keep yourself dry. So I find this way to actually be a lot more dry. So if we actually go here, and actually I missed that as well. So if we actually put the collection there, we're going to be typing, and the return on this is going to be our, I think it's eloquent collection. We're basically telling the return type is going to be a collection, or it could be a string, or it could be an integer. So that's all that's doing, if you're not aware of what that is. So we've got our base interface. So now we need to create a repository. So if we go repository, I always do this wrong, repositories, my spelling never been great. Right, so we're going to create a class. This is going to be our base repository, and we're simply going to implement the base interface. Now I'm going to simplify that by using the qualifier, i.e. importing that particular interface. So as you can see, PHP Storm has automatically implemented the all method. Like I said, you have to. When you implement that interface and you tell that interface we want this, the interface will just blow out all proportions and go, you haven't given us this particular method. Okay, great. So what do we do next? Well, if we go return and, sorry, no, I'm jumping ahead here, sorry. Right, so if we go back and look at our constructor in our base repository, you'll notice that actually we've got a constructor and it's saying model, and then we're initializing that particular property. So if we go ahead and we copy, actually I won't copy, I'll do it. So if we do public function construct, and what we're simply saying is we're basically going to be extending that base repository, which if we go back, we can see here we're going to extend that base repository, but we're also going to implement the interface. So, I mean, on this particular occasion, okay, I didn't notice that actually they've got two interfaces. They've got the Eloquent, which is the create and the find, which is fine. And then you've got your own user repository. Now, okay, I could have done it that way, but I'm not going to change it now because there's no point. It's just going to say waste time. But if you want to implement it that way, essentially what it's doing is you're saying you've got your base repository, which is going to implement what that particular thing is saying. It's going to implement the find, the create, all method, which Eloquent uses. With the user interface, what this is saying on this occasion is that we actually want to implement the all method. So while we just keep that as we're doing now, so if we do model, and we initialize the properties, we import that class and generate the docs. Okay, so what we're saying now is, so anytime we extend this base repository, we need to set up a construct and essentially tell the base repository the type of model we're going to be using. So if we create yet another repository, and this time we're going to do the event repository, which we're going to extend the base, maybe because I didn't uppercase it, yeah. Okay, so we're now extending the base repository. Now, because we're extending the base repository, we automatically inherit the base interface. So if we, for example, was to remove this, we can now see that this is going, oh no, we know we're meant to implement the method all. So if we do public function all, oops, not that. Return type declaration compatible base interface all. It's because we haven't got, yeah, it's because I didn't do the return type. So we can implement the all here, or we can also implement it here. Now, my personal preference is that we're actually going to do it in the base repository. So if we copy that and we come down to that, oh, God's sake, because it's hard. Right, actually, let's zoom in a little bit more. Might be able to see that better now. Yeah, so we're going to do the implementation of the all method here. So what does that mean? How do we use it? Because if we're using an event, well, normally if we go back to our controller, we'll use an event here, but we can't instantiate the event here because it doesn't work. So the way we do it is if we do return this model. Oh, so what we're saying is anytime we call this event repository, what we need to do is we need to tell our base repository, which is back in here, what our model is going to be. So if we come over to here and we do construct, we're going to tell this to be the event model. And we're going to do event, and we're going to do the event. Let's PHP docs. No, not that, sorry. Import the event class from the models. And there we go. So what will happen now, because we're passing we're telling it the model we're going to be using is the event, we can come into here, we're instantiating the class, which is being passed into the constructor of the model. So this is going, I want event, we're going to put that into the properties, and then we're saying, okay, with this event, oh, simple as that. So that is now our base done. So because I was talking about dry earlier, we can see now that if we ever do more repositories, whether it be a user repository, we don't need to, in every repository, do public function, all, return, user, all, event, all. We don't have to keep doing it over and over again. However, although every single one, we can use this base repository, it could be at some point we need to do something different. So I don't know, for example, with the event, we might want to eager load our users. Well, if we go back to our base, do we need to create another method to do that? Not really. So what we actually do is we actually override it. So if we do collection here, before it starts complaining again, we can now override the base repository. So if, for example, we wanted to use our event and eager load, we can simply override, and we do the event with, I think, can you do all with? I can't remember off the top of my head. I think you can. Users. Now, anytime we initialize this particular event repository, we can now simply use this particular all instead of this one. So we have the flexibility, should we need to override the base, but at the same time, should we not need to, we have all the code already in the base. There's no need to. So that's a good dry reason to obviously go choosing this particular way of doing it or over this one, simply because with this particular way of doing it, all we're doing is we create the interface, we create a repository, and then we're just doing a lot of code. And I've done it that way, and it actually turns out to be a lot more work to maintain. So I have found this particular pattern to work out so much better. So yeah, just to reiterate that. Okay, so let's remove this because we don't really need this for now. So, okay, well, how do we now use our repository? Well, if we come back to our controller, we now need to replace this. How do we do that? Well, we've got one or two ways. I can either show you by writing it, or I can explain it from the docs and then write. So if we come to here, and then we look at the controller, yep, here we go. So what this is essentially saying is when we're going to use the controller in the construct, we want to utilize the repository. In order to do that, we need to resolve the interface through Laravel's IOC, which basically is a lot of magic under the hood that will automatically register that particular interface and those classes to work with that. Now we do need to add one bit of code before that automatically magically does that. I will show you that in a minute, but essentially what doing, we just put that into a property, and then that particular property is that class that we can then call that method. Good, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Public function, and we're gonna call the construct. Inside here, we want to call the base interface, and then, oh, okay, I see why they did it that way. It's because they've separated it. Okay, well, on this occasion, for now, I'll come back to that and change that, and then I'll explain what I changed. But we'll simply do that for now. See, even though I realise and learn as I go along. So what we're going to do is we're going to now initialize these properties. Great. So, okay, we've got our base interface. We've got this base now. Again, I know that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but essentially what that is doing is, in a moment, it will be getting our repository. But that is why, in a moment when I explain, they created a separate user repository interface, which I'll show you right now why they did that. So if we do this base all, that's all our events now, or it would be in a moment. So how does all this work? Well, we still need to add that one bit of code that I mentioned. And if we go to our providers, now we can do it in one of our providers to make all this work, or we can create a new one, which I always opt to creating a new one just to make it more clean. So if we do PHP artisan make provider, and we're going to go a interface service provide. Great. So what we need to do inside this service provider, in order to make all the magic happen behind the scenes, is we simply need to tell Laravel what class the interface resolves to. So if we call the base class, the base interface, what class does that resolve to? Now to do that, we're going to call this app bind off the top of my head. I think it's bind. Okay, so what we want to say is we're going to bind to the Laravel's service container, the interface. So we're going to do base interface class, and then what class that's going to resolve to. So we want it to resolve to the event repository. Now let me explain why they did it the way they did it, which makes more sense. So the reason the way they made this separate interface makes more sense, because if we're going to call our base interface, it's not really going to make sense that the base is only going to resolve to the event repository. It makes no sense, does it? Like, if you're going to have your base interface, that needs to resolve to multiple. So if we go back to their example, and I believe it's further down here, yeah. So what they did is they bound our base interface to the base repository, and then they did another bind for the user repository interface to the user repository. So that means, which I'll change for the next video, that rather than us inside our event controller calling a base interface, it would actually be linked to our event interface. So that makes more sense that the event interface calls the event repository, and so forth, not base interface called in the event interface. So yeah, it was a little bit of a mess up on my side, but like I said, we all learn, eh? But that's essentially how we now called. Now that should automatically work. So let's go ahead and famous last words here. And it's not instantiable, building the event controller. Interesting. So that should, oh, I know what I did wrong. See, debugging. Now, how do we figure out what we've done wrong here? I know exactly what I've done wrong, but if I was to not know, let's go through that process. Right, okay, so this is saying that our interface doesn't work. Well, we just know from what I was just saying a minute ago how we need to tell Laravel that we want to instantiate that interface to those classes. Now, otherwise, Laravel does not know, but we've done that. So what happens? What happened? Like, why is it not working? We created a service provider. Now, that service provider, well, it's not in use. We didn't tell Laravel to use it. That's where we've gone wrong. So, how do we tell Laravel to use this service provider? Well, let's go to the docs. Let's go to service provider. Okay, so this is telling us how we create our service provider. Okay, so writing service providers. Okay, so we made our provider like so. The register method, no, that's not really going to help us. That's just talking about the actual register method inside the service provider. Okay, so let's continue. Boot method, no, that's not really going to help us. Okay, oh, registering the provider. Okay, well, we didn't do that, did we? So all service providers are registered in the config app. Okay, cool. So let's go to the config app. And we're looking for providers. Hey ho, there we go. So we need to register our provider. Providers, interface, service provider, class. Hey ho. So maybe that was the reason. Hey ho, and it was. So that is a way how we can get our controllers nice and skinny, keep our models nice and skinny as much as possible if we're doing a lot of query scopes and relationships. That is a way how we can keep it nice and maintained. Now, you can test interfaces as well. So when we come to do testing, which will be towards the end of it, I know really we should maybe opt for test-driven development, but we don't really need to at the moment. I'm just trying to go through the processes of how we can do a real world app. Maybe on another project we can actually do a proper real world start from TDD, which are again another way of working in the real world. So yeah, we know that's fully working. I didn't set up the actions yet. One thing I wanted to quickly cover before we finish is you can see here we've got our start date / time. It's in a horrible format. Now, if we was to, for example, sorry, I'm in the wrong file. I just wanted to cover one little topic. You may already know, but it's still worth to know. We go, sorry, not our index, we want our events. Oh, sorry, one more thing. Naming conventions. So one of my personal favorites, which I can share a URL for general best practices for Laravel, which I've tried to follow as much as I can for quite a while now. And in terms of the naming conventions, all lowercase folders, and then I always try to follow the CRUD type naming convention. So if we've got an index method, it will return an index view. If we're in a edit view, it will be edit.blade and create.blade, show.blade. So I just generally try to keep those in their own folders in those particular naming conventions, unless obviously the method name is not a resource but rather a custom. Then I would just go with the custom. So I don't know if it was uh, Jello, then I do jello.blade. I try and keep the method names and the view names the same, just for a bit of consistency. Um, but back to what I was saying, if we go back to here and we look at the created, oops, underscore app, again we get that time. But if we actually use Carbon, we can actually format that to be whatever we want. There we go. Not that in a pretty day, but still. But if we go back and we try and do our event underscore start, it's going to throw us an error. Okay, well, why? It's a date time, so we should be able to use it. Well, okay, let's go down our debugging route again. So we're saying call to member function format on string. Okay, so let's just simply copy that. See what it says. Always prefix with Laravel. So what was this saying? Okay. In your article class, add the following property. Right, protected dates. Okay. So what this is saying is we can add something to the model, or we can prefix these carbon to it, which makes it look really messy. So we're parsing the date that we're passing in and then format. That's no good. That's horrible. So this is saying we can create something in the article in the model. So let's go to the docs, date mutators. Now this is using an old version. So if we go to the latest version, then we look at the no, is it custom casts? Date casting. There we go. So it's quite simply the attributes we should cast. So by default, Eloquent will cast created and updated, which is why those worked and our one didn't. So this is saying we need to tell Laravel, because that's a particular date time field, we need to cast to be a carbon instance. So we can quite easily, if we go into our model, our event, again, copy the dot block. We do our event underscore start. We don't really need a, I mean, we could format it, but I like to use the format. I don't really like to prefix it like that, but again, it's preference. So if we come back now, and there we go, our format is now working. So see the processing we go through for the debug process and trying to think, okay, how do we start this? That's how I generally always start it. Laravel errors are very common and very well descripted and very well put out on the web. So 9 times out of 10, the error you get from Laravel, you can find an answer for. It's quite simple as that. So that's why I always prefix Laravel. I'm trying to think of a random error. Laravel, I don't know, error. Simple as that. Displaying error messages. So, see what I mean? Like, although my particular search was very vague, it pretty much showed an instant issue regarding displaying errors. So just prefixing with Laravel and trying to be using that particular error, like I say, 9 times out of 10, you'll get the answer straight away. So that's pretty much it in terms of that. What I'm going to do now is I'll set you a task. I want you to go away and I want you to actually begin creating a interface for the user. I want you to update our repository in our base repository. So if we go back to the site, I will put these sites, the site that we used here, in the description. The other thing that, just before you go, if you go into Google and do Laravel best practices, this is the one that I follow as much as I possibly can, because I found it really useful, and it's very much Laravel community way of doing things. So here, look, they're talking about using fat models over skinny controllers, like we was mentioning about having fat controllers. So, like I said, some people love having their models having a lot of the SQL stuff, eloquent stuff in their models. I don't really personally like that, but it's a preference. If you want to do it that way, that's absolutely fine. But this is a very good website. I'll put it in the description. But yeah, so I want you to follow this particular website. I want you to go back, create these user repositories and interfaces like I should have done, which I'll do for the next video. And then, yeah, I'll hope to see you in the next video. And we can go through actually creating a few more bits to actually try and get a front end up to actually begin showing the stream. Because I have actually, if I show you, I have already got I have already got a streaming URL in my database. So I want to get that to that point as much as possible and as quickly as possible. But at the same time, I want you to understand the reasons and what we can do as we go through the app. So thanks for watching. I hope I didn't bore you too much, and I hope it was insightful and helpful and informative. Like I said, like at the start, if you've got any questions, any issues that you're running into that you try and need help with, you can't get help with, or you can't find on the internet, please feel free to ask. I will try my best to answer and help as much as I can. Or if you've got a video request, I will try and do a video on whatever the request is, as long as I understand it. There's no point me doing a video if I don't understand it. So like and subscribe my videos, and I'll see you in the next video.